Sarah's Ghost House, an architectural funhouse. In 1862, Sarah Pardee had everything to look forward to. That year, she married William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester rifle fortune. At that time, the Winchester rifle was the most famous rifle in the world. Sarah and her husband moved to a large, lovely home in New Haven, Connecticut. Soon, they had a baby girl whom they named Annie Pardee. Then, tragedy struck. Just 1 month after her birth, baby Annie died from a mysterious illness. A few short months later, William also died. Sarah was devastated. She withdrew into her home and refused to see anyone. She thought only of her double tragedy and became convinced that the Winchesters were cursed. The rifle that bore their name had been responsible for the deaths of thousands. Sarah felt that the spirits of those dead people were seeking revenge. Sarah had always been interested in the occult, the mysteries of the spirit world. Now she became obsessed with it. Hoping to make contact with her baby and her husband, Sarah invited mediums into her home. Mediums claim that they, next page, can contact the dead through meetings called seances. None of the mediums, however, was able to get through to William or baby Annie. Then Sarah learned of a medium named Adam Coons who lived in Boston. People assured her that if anyone could make contact with the dead, he could. Without telling him who she was, Sarah visited Coons and he agreed to stage a seance for her. During the seance, Coons told Sarah that the spirit of her late husband was standing beside her. "Tell him that I miss him desperately," she said. "He wants you to know that he will always be with you," Coons replied. Then he gave Sarah a chilling warning. "Unless you do something in their memory, the ghosts of those who have been killed by Winchester rifles will haunt you forever." "But what can I do?" Sarah pleaded. Coons told her that she was to move to the west and buy a house that her husband's spirit would pick out. Then she was to enlarge the house, making sure it had enough room to house those spirits. As long as she continued to build onto the house, Sarah was told she would remain alive and unharmed. Coons had not been told Sarah's identity. How, then, did he know about her husband's death and the family's connection to the Winchester rifle? Sarah was convinced that the ghost of her husband had spoken through the medium. She set out to follow his instructions. In 1884, Sarah sold her home in New Haven and traveled to California. There, following what she later said was William's advice, she bought an 8-room house on 44 acres of land in San Jose, a city 50 miles south of San Francisco. She set about enlarging the house. Luckily, money was no problem. Sarah had inherited William's fortune, about $20 million. She also received about $1,000 a day from the Winchester Arms Company. Sarah hired a small army of workers. There were 18 carpenters, 12 gardeners, and countless plumbers, plasterers, stonemasons, and painters. For the next 38 years, they worked around the clock every day all year long. The hammering and sawing never ceased. Sarah herself took charge of every detail of the work. Each morning she gave the head workman the plans she had sketched on an old envelope or paper bag the night before, and each night she would seek the opinions of the ghosts that she said inhabited the house. More often than not, it seems, they did not like her plans, or they would change their minds about what they wanted. The result was that walls built one day would be torn down the next. Windows would be installed only to be blocked up. Doors were added, then taken out, and so on. One worker spent 33 years doing nothing but laying fancy wooden floors and then tearing them up. As each new room was completed, Sarah would furnish it or fill it with treasures that would later be used to furnish other rooms. Some rooms held rolls of costly French wallpapers. Others held stacks of paintings. Still others were crammed with ornaments of copper, gold, and silver. Railroad cars filled with European and Asian riches for the mansion arrived almost daily at the San Jose depot. For small items, Sarah shopped locally. She drove one of her 2 automobiles, both two-tone lavender and yellow Pierce Arrows. When she arrived at the store, she never got out of the car. No matter, for the eager shopkeepers gladly brought items out for her approval. Sarah spent almost as much time planning the grounds as she did the house. She ordered her gardeners to plant a 6-foot-high cypress hedge around the entire estate. They also planted exotic gardens and orchards. Elaborate fountains spewed water 24 hours a day, and paths wound through this wonderland in a confusing maze. In honor of the many Native Americans killed by white armies using Winchester rifles, Sarah had a statue sculpted for the garden. It depicted Chief Little Fawn shooting arrows. In the end, the house covered 6 acres. It contained 160 rooms, 47 fireplaces, and 40 staircases. There were 10,000 windows, 52 skylights, 467 doorways, 6 kitchens, a formal dining room, and a grand ballroom. In all, Sarah spent $5 million on her ghost house. Some details of the house are quite odd. It has 5 heating systems and 3 elevators. Secret passageways are everywhere, but many lead to blank walls. Many of the staircases lead nowhere. One has 40 steps, each one only 2 inches high. One room has nothing but trapdoors. Another has a skylight in the floor. On the second floor, some of the doors open into thin air. Sarah was obsessed by the number 13. Each light fixture has 13 globes. Some staircases have 13 steps. The house has 13 bathrooms, and Sarah's bathroom has 13 windows. The house took up Sarah's every waking moment. The work was all she had, for she never invited anyone into the house. Even a president was turned away from the door. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt dropped by for a visit, but was told by a servant that the house was not open to strangers. He never did get in. But perhaps Sarah was not alone in her rambling mansion. In her later years, it was said that every night when the tower bell tolled midnight, organ music wafted from the house. It could not have been Sarah playing, for her fingers had grown so stiff with age that she could hardly hold a pencil. Clearly, Sarah herself believed that she had ghostly guests, for she dined with them each evening. Servants would set 13 places at the table, heap each plate with food, and fill the crystal goblets with the finest wines. That was Sarah's nightly offering to any spirits who cared to dine. "Good evening," she would say. "I am pleased that you have come to share my food and my house. Please enjoy yourselves." Early each morning, the servants would clear the dining room. They never revealed whether the food and wine had been touched. Outwardly, Sarah was the perfect hostess, but secretly, she was terrified of the ghosts. So that they wouldn't find her when she was sleeping, she slept in a different room each night. Sarah Winchester devoted her life to making amends to those who had been killed by the Winchester rifles. But the house she labored over was not enough to save her, despite Adam Kunz's promise that she would not die as long as she kept the building. She died there in 1922 at the age of 85. At the time of her death, there was enough material on the site to continue building for another 38 years. Sarah left no will, so the furnishings were put up for auction. It took 6 large vans working 8 hours a day for 6 weeks to haul off all her belongings. A year later, the house itself was sold. The new owners opened it to visitors, charging a fee for the opportunity to wander through it. On May 13, 1974, the Winchester House was designated a California Historical Landmark. Today, visitors marvel at the strange, sprawling building. Frequent visitors say that the house is larger today than it was when Sarah died. Since there were no plans for the house, no blueprints, there is no proof. Still, people insist that new rooms have been added. Could Sarah still be trying to make amends? Some people think so. But whatever the case, the Winchester house is like no other house on earth, an architectural funhouse built for the comfort of invisible residents. Medusa. The king's lips curled up into a cruel smile. King Polydectes, a mythical ruler in ancient Greece, was intensely pleased with himself. For a long time he had been trying to think of a way to kill a young man named Perseus. The king wanted to marry Perseus's beautiful mother, but he was afraid Perseus would stand in his way. Now, at last, he thought he had found a way to get rid of Perseus. He was confident that he had planned the perfect crime. The king's plan was to ask Perseus to go on a mission to prove his courage and manliness. The mission would be to seek out and kill a monster named Medusa. Many men had tried to kill Medusa, but all had been destroyed by her. The king was sure that Perseus, too, would lose his life to the monster. The plan was perfect because Perseus would die, but no one would accuse the king of being a murderer. Everyone would simply think that Perseus had gotten himself killed while trying to be a hero. The wicked king summoned Perseus to his castle and pretended to be friendly. He put his arm around the young man's shoulders. "Perseus," he said, "at some point all men must find a way to prove their courage. I have a challenge for you that will allow you to do this. Your challenge is to slay Medusa and bring me her head. Her head will be proof to everyone of your bravery." When Perseus heard the king's challenge, he was frightened. He knew all about Medusa. She was the fiercest of all monsters. Once she had been a beautiful maiden, but she had angered the gods. In their wrath, they had turned her into a hideous monster. Now she had long curved claws, powerful wings, and sharp fangs. For hair, she had a mass of hissing, snarling snakes that were constantly coiling and striking. But deadliest of all was her face. It was so full of evil that anyone who looked at it was instantly turned to stone. Although Perseus was nervous as he contemplated all of this, he did not want to seem like a coward. He said bravely, "I will bring you Medusa's head." The king was delighted. His plan was working. As Perseus set out on his mission, there was little chance that he would succeed. Luckily, Zeus, king of the gods, was aware of the king's scheme. Zeus called on the other gods to help Perseus. Hermes, swiftest of the gods, gave Perseus a pair of wings for his feet, so that he could travel quickly. The goddess Athena gave him a shield with a mirror-like surface. "When you reach Medusa," Athena explained, "look only at her reflection in the shield. If you gaze directly at her, you will be turned to stone." Armed with the wings and the shield, Perseus quickly made his way to the land where Medusa lived. Along the last few miles, he saw many men who had been turned to stone. They stood frozen in place for all time. When at last he reached the hollow where the monster lived, Perseus saw that the ground was covered with petrified figures. Quickly, he turned his back and, using his mirrored shield to guide him, began walking backward toward the hollow. As Perseus neared the center of the hollow, he saw something moving in the reflection from his shield. It was the snakes on Medusa's head, shimmering in the mirror. The serpents seemed relatively peaceful. Perseus guessed that Medusa was asleep. He hoped to slay her while she slept, but as soon as he edged closer, his foot accidentally kicked a stone. The stone clattered down into the hollow, and the monster awoke. Her mighty roar filled the air. Looking into his shield, Perseus could see her rise into view, her jaws agape and her terrible eyes flashing. With his back still turned, Perseus drew his sword. The creature hesitated for a moment, as if surprised that this man was not turning into stone. Then, snake heads hissing, Medusa rushed towards Perseus. Perseus's heart pounded as the monster approached. He stood with his legs spread wide, braced for action. With one hand he held up his shield, in the other he gripped his sword. Soon, Medusa was so close that Perseus could feel her hot breath on his neck. Still, he stood his ground. He waited until her mouth was about to clamp down on him. Then, he swept his sword around behind him in a slashing blow. He felt the cutting edge bite into Medusa's neck. There was a terrible cry. Then, there was silence. Perseus surveyed the dead monster's reflection. He did not turn to look at it with his own eyes. The gods had warned him that even in death, Medusa's face would turn a person to stone. Carefully, Perseus reached behind him and picked up the snake-covered head. He dropped it into a sack and began to return journey. When Perseus arrived home, he found his mother in tears. She had been forced to agree to a marriage with King Polydectes. Perseus was furious. He went straight to the king's castle to confront him. When the king saw the young man, he was shocked. He had been sure that Perseus would not return. As Polydectes watched, Perseus turned his head away and reached into the sack. Seeing that Perseus wasn't looking, the king grabbed a sword. Before he could strike, however, Perseus pulled the head of Medusa from the sack, and the king was instantly turned to stone. Perseus became a hero in his kingdom. He had saved his mother from a marriage to a tyrant. He had freed the people from the rule of the evil Polydectes, and he had killed the fierce Medusa.